Joining me now with his perspective is a man who's ministered to the Black Catholic community in Washington, D.C. as a priest of the Archdiocese of Washington for years. He's a columnist for the National Catholic Register. Welcome to the program, Monsignor Charles Pope. Monsignor, you've served most of your life in predominantly African-American parishes. You've seen racism up close. In light of the ongoing protests and the rioting, what are your parishioners telling you, and what are they looking for from the church?
Yeah, and I've ministered in the Black community. I'm also, as you know, kind of in the wide church too, and I hear from a lot of different sides in the church, and starting with the African-American community. I mean, I think that what we have to recognize is that there's been a long and a shared grief in the African-American community. Whatever the statistics show, there's a very strong perception and experience among them of police brutality, distrust, kind of a disparity in the way they are treated. Not just by the police, but in other settings, and trying to hail a cab while black. These types of experiences are very real. These are good, solid men and women. They're not, just someone who's making up a story. These are people I've almost grown up with, and I believe them, and their experiences are very real, and they have grief, and I hold that grief in my heart as a priest, and so. That's certainly in my experience in the African-American community, that racial injustices are still very real.
Mm-hmm. And what are they asking for the church? What do they want the church to do in this moment?
Well, I think generally there's a lot of differences here, but I would say the general ask is that I think all of us become more aware of it. And I think one of the things, Raymond, we do very poorly in our culture, all of us, is to really learn to listen to each other's experiences and not just discount it, but to incorporate it and to include it and to work very hard to whenever we see it, to overcome it, and to look into our own hearts and to see where some of that might lurk itself, that how we perceive other people and treat them. So that would be, I think, the primary ask. Now, there could be lots of legal things that, that's going to vary with person to person.
Right. Right. Now, this past Saturday, you led a rosary procession in Washington, D.C., with lay and religious Catholic faithful praying for the healing of racism for the community. Why aren't we seeing more peaceful, prayerful demonstrations like this coming from the Catholic Church, not only in Washington, across the country?
Yeah, well, I think that I hope that we actually are, and maybe some are just more hidden. In fact, we didn't go down to Lafayette Square intentionally because we wanted this to not be politicized. Too much of this has become about the president. This is about George Floyd. It's about people he represents in terms of the experience with the police. This is about looking to our own hearts. So we just earnestly wanted to pray. So we walked on our own Capitol Hill neighborhood. Maybe that doesn't get as much coverage. And of course, our churches, so many of them are shut down. It's harder for us to be seen out there together. All of these are factors. And, there's a lot of frustration that we've been excluded. Our churches are still closed while other people are out demonstrating. There's all sorts of things that run through people's mind.
Yeah, yeah. No, here in New Orleans, our Archbishop led a procession, which also got very little coverage, but it was a quiet procession, and it was black and white Catholics moving along. And like D.C., this is we have a very vibrant black Catholic community here. But again, he didn't make a big show of it. He didn't go downtown. And as you said, we have to depoliticize this thing. I mean, it's becoming, because we're in a presidential year, it's becoming about presidential politics, even though this is a local matter in Minneapolis. Though it happens across the country, these are local police departments. The president, the Congress doesn't have control over these police departments and the brutality or lack thereof on the local level. It's a case by case. Last Friday, you wrote a piece in the National Catholic Register, a priestly testimony of grief in these times. And you point out that Catholics all share the outrage of what happened to George Floyd, but they're also grieving it being kept away from the sacraments, and even over the language Archbishop Gregory used when the president visited the John Paul II shrine last week. You're right, Archbishop Gregory said, "I find it baffling and reprehensible that any Catholic facility would allow itself to be so egregiously misused and manipulated in a fashion that violates our religious principles." Agree or not, these are strong, vigorous words, you write, but why are such strong, vigorous words not heard in denunciation of other Catholic institutions that have chosen to honor Speaker Nancy Pelosi or Father James Martin or others who violate our religious principles? What effect does this selective outrage have on Catholics, do you think?
it's an experience of disparity, and that's why, as I say, I think in my heart as a priest, I have so many African American people I know and love and have ministered to over the years and continue. There's so many other people I know and love through the wider church, through my writings and EWTN radio and programs like this, and they all write to me, and they're really saying the same thing. They experience a lot of disparity. That there's selective outrage, that some of our key core principles go ignored. And this isn't just Archbishop Gregory, who I think probably spoke very forthrightly, but would that this appeals to all the bishops. Would that they would be so forthright about, as you mentioned, just some examples like that. So that causes real grief in people's hearts. That is for a different reason, but it's that same grief. We're not being treated fairly. We who sit in the pews and really care about issues of transgenderism or marriage or abortion and so on, and we're not really being given an even-handed treatment with some others who, where there's outrage experienced very quickly by the bishops. So again, these would be that's a grief about disparity. And so, isn't it interesting? Two very different groups, but they have really have the same complaint, and this ultimately unites us. That there's sometimes an unfairness or a disparity in treatment that people experience.
In a recent blog post, you talked about, we only have a couple of minutes, you talked about secularism, materialism, individualism being significant challenges to the church's preaching the gospel today. After that rosary procession this weekend, you indicated that the problems we're seeing in regards to racism and police brutality are not black or white problems, but a much graver problem. And there's no doubt there's been a breakdown of community in the last few decades, beginning with the breakdown of the family. Talk to us about how the breakdown of the family and the lack of integrated friendships and living have brought us to this moment. This is something I always think about, Monsignor, because unlike living in Northern Virginia, where you rarely encountered other people of other races, I mean, what I mean by that is black people and white people didn't frequent the same places. I live in a city where we do everything together here, including have families together. So it's a very different culture.
Yes, it is. And, as you mentioned, the breakdown of the family. Look, the breakup of the family is the nuclear fission of civilization. The family, the individual is not the basic unit of society, the family is. And, you split the families, like you split the atom, and tremendous destructive potential goes out in all directions that if it's not reined in, it will lay everything waste. And so it starts there. But also, we used to have a shared experience of a kind of a biblical world vision that began to break down in the 50s, and it's all but gone now. And so you have people like Governor Cuomo and Mayor de Blasio saying faith had nothing to do with turning back the COVID virus, and there's no place for this. And the opening of churches is tough. It's okay to go out and protest, but don't you dare open those churches. That is far too dangerous for you to gather in those churches. And again, that's a perceived disparity that causes believers everywhere real grief. Protest has its place, but prayer has its place, and we're no longer.
First Amendment.
There's no respect for this, or secularism.
Yeah. Monsignor, thank you for your insights, and you can read more of Monsignor Charles Pope's blogs by visiting the National Catholic Register's website, ncregister.com. Monsignor, thank you for being here.
Good, thank you.